Enterprise agreement for all.
We held last week, so that we can focus more on the implementation of the NM5 plus and above, and we really want to get this right, so we thought we'd spend some extra time presenting on it and also answering any questions that we can help people with. Having said that, it's not likely to go for the entire 3 hours, so but let's wait and see depending on how many questions we get. So I'm joined today by Lexie Roso from our office, and also Paul Gilbert, the Assistant Secretary of the ANMF. So Lexie and Paul will both be co-presenting with me today. And we just say that we really appreciate Paul's time and also the ANMF's ongoing efforts in the implementation space. We really we're very thankful for that. So again, we'll be splitting the presentation today between the three of us. Just in terms of a bit more on housekeeping, if people can keep themselves on mute throughout the session, that would be appreciated. We will have a very long space at the end for questions, so people will get the opportunity to ask any questions they have. And just a note on those questions, so they will probably a mixture of general and quite specific questions. We'll try our best to answer those, but there may need to be some that we have to take on notice, but we'll try and answer as many as we can in today's session. So that's the introduction. I should just say Stuart's an apology today. Stuart's been caught up on another meeting that he's had to go to, but I'm sure he's with us in spirit. So just in terms of the agenda today, we'll go through the introduction. Paul will take us through the background and the drivers for the change and the fundamentals of the change. And then Lexie and I will share the steps in the translation process. What we've really tried to do is really to step it out step by step to make it as simple for members to do as possible. We know that everyone's very busy these days, so we thought the more information or the more of a framework we can provide people, the better. And then we'll jointly take questions at the end of that. So I might hand over to Paul for the background and associated slides. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Lexie, and hello, everyone. We've tried to do a few things unsuccessfully in the first instance in the 2016 agreement, but in the 2020 agreement, we've tidied up the quite a lot, comprehensively, one might say, around the introduction of the four-stream grading structure. The translation for that for most people is at worst a change of pay code, and you may not even notice that. But for many people, there are quite refined new classifications covering particularly the nurse managers at level 5 and above, but also the grading changes now to the likes of, you can see the first one there, which luckily we did back away from clinical research and advanced practice for acronym reasons. That means you would have a CAPR grade. So you might be familiar with being a grade 4 or a grade 3. You will be a CAPR something. Nurse managers similarly might be used to being a grade 5 or a ZB something. They will be an NM something in terms of their grading. Community nursing similarly, community health nurse would historically be a grade 3B, would be a CN3 or CN2 under the new agreement. And the quality, clinical risk governance, education, etc. is typically your nurse educators, and they again have a different grading title, a QRED something. But today's focus is on the nurse manager translation, because it's the one that had the most historical quirks that we needed to address. So where we started off with a fundamental problem is that the nurse managers in particular putting aside nurse unit managers, anyone above nurse unit manager was typically graded to a bed number. And historically, there were sometimes 7, 8 or 9 increments based on bed numbers in the agreement. And once upon a time, hospitals used to publish their bed numbers, and they were the number of registered beds declared to the health department. That ceased being published and ceased being a requirement a long time ago. And we were left with a structure that, based on bed numbers, that no one could really ascertain. So we've tried to create a system that can develop over time if needs be. We've really looked at the where hospitals lay in the bed numbers scheme of things and tried to categorise them into groups based on that. And rather than worrying about the bed numbers, as I think Tim or Lexie will explain later, it's a question of going to the appendix and seeing where you're named. We have created some, we had a long history of people being classified as supervisor. Supervisor was someone with responsibilities above that of a charge nurse or a nurse unit manager, but they were paid less. And it was a funny old classification that had been around, I suspect, since the day when the days when the Don worked 7 days a week in the morning and the night nurse in charge at night, and it's just sort of hang out there as this extra kind of role that wasn't at all defined, and yet an enormous number of people appeared to be classified as a supervisor. So we've tried to create new definitions around the work that would attract the supervisor classification or grading in the new agreement, whilst maintaining similar. I've just got moths. I don't know if anyone else had a moth invasion overnight, but if it lands in my coffee, I'll be very unimpressed. We've included provisions around, or continued provisions around ADONs and DONs, and introduced an executive DON grading structure, which is, as no doubt will be explained later, some hospitals have them. There's no obligation to have an executive DON, but some hospitals do have them. Generally, that's the Director of Nursing across multiple campuses, but also commonly the Chief Nursing Specialist hospitals, that kind of thing. So we hope that we've created a comprehensive structure that picks up all the possible nurse manager machinations, and we must have, because we've got a classification for a nurse manager not classified elsewhere. So for the avoidance of doubt, everyone's got a classification. It's just a question of where you fit into that, and there is a process to be followed between now and the end of the year to lock all of that in, which Tim and Lexie will explain shortly. So as I said, change from bed capacity. The change probably isn't as dramatic as people might anticipate. It's been socialised quite widely to try and make sure that people were content with where they fell within those 4 levels. And it's a bit of a fillip for the major regional hospitals who sort of move up to the top level. And nobody loses out, so that's an important point to make. And that probably covers it off, I think.
So in terms of a process overview, the way we'll be taking members through it today is talking about the streams very briefly, each 4 of the streams. So you can identify, I guess, the cohort of people. This is the second step, identify the cohort of people or the pool of people who require a translation. Post that, we've got a transition or a translation paper exercise that you'll be able to see on screen, and we'll show you how to do that. Once you've kind of figured out where everyone is meant to be sitting, we would advise you to obviously write to the employees with the outcome. Like Paul said, it should not be as a dramatic change as perhaps people are imagining at this point in time. But then also we're hoping that this transfer can occur from the first full pay period on or after 1 October 2021, and then backdated to the first full pay period on or after 1 December 2020, which was when the original translation was hoping to take place. So that's a bit of your process overview of how you're going to implement it on your end. Going to the next slide, we'll talk about the streams just briefly. So as Paul's touched on, we've got a few new acronyms in here. The main thing that we're going to be focusing on today is your nurse manager, not elsewhere classified. Not nurse manager stream, which includes the nurse manager, the new nurse manager, not elsewhere classified. But as he's also briefly touched on, we've got that clinical advanced practice and research stream, which is your CAPR stream. And this comprises of the classifications that are principally engaged in your clinical work, your advanced practice space, consultancy, drug and alcohol inpatients, and research. We're doing a little bit more work on that during the life of the agreement. We've got a kind of working group that's set up to hopefully have a few new classifications in that stream as well. We've also got the QRED stream, which is your clinical quality, risk, governance, and education. And like Paul said, that's principally filled with those people who are engaged on clinical support, clinical development, education, and risk management. And this should relatively reflect kind of status quo within health services at the moment. We've then got our community stream, and that's district nursing, community, domiciliary, ambulatory, outpatients, and community health, including HITPAC and HARP. Employees in that group. And then we've got kind of the classification at the moment, which is your nurse manager stream, which is all those classifications that are principally engaged with those who are managing a nursing or midwifery service or part thereof of any stream. So in talking about the nurse managers, we then need to identify the pool that requires the translation. So that's the nurse managers. Now, only NM5 and aboves should be reclassified. So that's from your after-hour coordinators up. We're not talking about the nurse manager 1, 2, 3, and 4, which we've done that previous process starting in 2019. They're going to remain the same. So it's only NM5 and above. Now, your first step within this structure is to identify any campuses that need a director of nursing, and then determine where that's meant to be appointed, and then determine what classification they're meant to be. So how you determine whether you need a DON is based on a definition that we've introduced into the agreement, which is the definition of campus. And we've talked about a campus being a site operated by an employer that provides day procedure surgery or multi-day inpatient services or residential aged care. So that's 3 kind of components in that first section. So it's your day procedure surgery or multi-day inpatient services or residential aged care. We have put in a couple of exclusions, as you can see on screen. So a community health centre doesn't need a DON. A site where it's only aged care beds that don't meet the definition of high care beds. Now, we know that the definition of low care and high care has kind of been abolished at this point in time. But if you didn't meet the definition of high care beds under the Safe Patient Care Act, then you don't need a DON. DHSV is also excluded, and private residence is also excluded. We've also got a note at the end there that shows that if you provide a satellite service that's co-located on a campus controlled by another employer, you don't need 2 DONs there. So that's your definition of campus. And that's how you identify whether you need a DON. So if you don't meet one of those exclusions, you need a DON on the campus. Your step 2 is then to identify where that DON should be classified in our kind of range. And now in Appendix 8, which I can show you here on screen, this is a simplified version. In Appendix 8, we have a list of all campuses and where their DON should sit. So the first step would be to have a look at Appendix 8, identify where your campus is on that list, and then classify your DON in accordance with that list. So if your campus is listed under 7A, the DON should be classified and translated over to that 7A. If they're listed under 8A, your DON should be classified as an 8A. But while we have tried our best to provide a comprehensive list, and like Paul said, it's been widely socialised through bargaining and post-bargaining. There may be some campuses that pop up or are created that aren't on that list. And so what we've done in that instance is we've provided definitions that we've tried to align as closely as we can to the groupings that we've put under each kind of classification. So your 8A DON, as you can see on screen, is a DON of a major campus of a metropolitan health service or a major regional health service. It then tapers down to the 8B, which is a main health service campus of a large regional health service. And that's typically your ex-base hospitals or a large district hospital that's not named in 8A. So if you're not named in 8A, you're probably going to be in 8B. Your 8C is then for any mid-range campuses of a metropolitan health service, a campus that is a metropolitan community hospital, or a campus that was a district hospital, but it's not named in 8B. So you can kind of see how we're tapering it down so that all the campuses are kind of grouped with like campuses. Your 8D is then a small health service that includes acute services. Your 7A is a large multi-ward campus that does not include acute services. So that's the difference there with acute services. And then your 7B is a small campus that does not include acute services as well. So if you're not listed in any of the one kind of categories in Appendix 8, you should have a look at the definitions, and ANMF and VHIA will be more than willing to help you if that does arise. But we anticipate, for the most part, at the start, everyone should be listed. I'll then step to step 3, which is Tim.
Thanks, Lexie. So in terms of, once we've worked out which classification the DON is, and again, we just go to Appendix 8 and we anticipate that all the campuses will have a classification within Appendix 8. You only go to the definitions if someone is missing, but I'm sure there'll be someone missing, but we've gone to a lot of pain to try and make sure that they're not. So once that DON's locked in, then you go to the DDON. So the DDON definition is there on screen. So it's the second dot point. A deputy DON or director of midwifery is a registered nurse midwife who is appointed to a camp as a campus director. I'll start again. That was terrible. A deputy DON or DOM is a registered nurse midwife who is appointed as a campus director, deputy director of nursing to assist the director of nursing in the day-to-day administration of the campus. So that's the definition that we're looking to appoint to the DDON level. Employers don't have to appoint a DDON or DDOM if they don't have those requirements. And that last dot point is how they're then classified. So they're aligned with the DON classification. So once you have the DON classification, that translates into what the DDON is. And we'll just check the next page, which just shows you that alignment sheet. So you can see there the DDON's in red. So once you've identified which of those employees meet that definition, you then classify them in accordance with 6A to 6D, depending on what the DON is. So if the DON is a 7B or an 8D, then the DDON is a 6D. If the DON is a 7A or an 8C, then the DDON is a 6C. And for 8B and 8A, they just translate directly to 6B and 6A. So the translation for the DDONs are really easy. All you need to do is just identify who meets that definition and then apply the classification of the DON. So that takes us to the next one. So the DDONs have been split out into two categories. The first one is that DDON who meets that definition that we just talked about. And there's also a second element that's a divisional or clinical director classification. And you'll see there at dot 1 what that definition is. It is a registered nurse midwife who has responsibility for a clinical division of the health service. So they are what the divisional clinical directors are defined as in the agreement. So if we just go to the next slide just for a second. So again, they translate the same as the DDON. you'd identify what classification the Director of Nursing is, and then they slide into one of those 4 definitions at 6A to 6D. We might just go back to that previous slide for a second because there's just a bit we need to cover off. So this is a change to the classification structure, not in that it's specific, but it's just a new dimension to the DDON role. And what that means is that people have got to make some choices just around whether they translate to that new structure or they preserve their current arrangement. So what that means is that people often will not just have their nursing structure based on a site structure. They might have a matrix, like a program structure overlaying a site structure or something similar. So what that might mean is that they've got multiple DONs on the same campus, but because of a program approach. Technically, through the translation, what would happen is that those non-campus DONs would translate to a clinical or divisional director classification. But we do have a way to preserve the existing structures. So what the department has agreed with the parties to do is to fund that additional cost where there is an additional cost in preserving the current arrangement. So what that might mean is that instead of translating, a women's and children DON to a divisional clinical director classification, they could stay as a DON, and that might mean an uplift, or it might mean that they're staying at the same level. How that will occur is that the department will do a specific survey just in terms of capturing those exact costs, but health services have got an option about preserving their current nursing structures, which is really important in terms of the implementation of this structure. So the second one, the third point there is just around that translation. So they go to the same as the DDON, the 6A, 6B, 6D, 6C or 6D if you're choosing to translate them. And the last one there is that it's possible that with those program arrangements that you may have, say, for instance, the Women and Children's Director of Nursing, you might have them across multiple campuses. The classification for that person in those circumstances is whatever the highest campus they're covering. So, if they're covering, the Alfred site plus Sandringham, for instance, then they would be classified at the Alfred site being a 8A. Thanks, Lexie. So we'll go to the next slide. So that takes us through, so we've done the DONs, which is just a reference to Appendix 8. We've done the the NM6, which is that distinction between the traditional DDON and that clinical director. Now that takes us to the grade 5s. So there's 5 grade 5 classifications within the agreement, and they can be split into 2 different categories: those that are non-campus aligned and those that are campus aligned. So you'll see there on the screen, this is the 5 different classifications, but number 3 and number 4 are non-campus aligned definitions. So this was within the last agreement, but it wasn't implemented, but with the 2020 agreement, they will be implemented. And this is a little bit of a different approach than historically has been. So historically, they've been based on the campus number of beds. These aren't based on that, and they're not based on the site either. They're based on what the person is actually doing. So you'll see there that an ADON level 1 is a registered nurse who has responsibility for a project or process in more than one campus or across all units, wards in a single health service, will be classified as an assistant director of nursing NM5B. So not only is it not the campus and not the beds, but it's a specific task and it's a specific classification level. So these are a little bit different. And then the second one there is that nurse manager 5 ADON level 2, which with the definition being is a registered nurse who has responsibility for a project or process affecting more than one ward or unit within a campus, will be classified as an assistant director of nursing level 2 and classified as NM5C. So what's important to do there for people through the implementation is to identify the pool, as Lexie talked about, and then in the first instance to those grade 5s, apply those 2 definitions because they might separate some people out from the rest. So that's the next step. The second half of that step is just over the page, is for the campus those ones are aligned with the campus, which is this slide. So these are the ones that are traditionally aligned with the campus, and we'll talk about that last one in a minute, but the first two are based on what the classification is of the campus. So all the after hours coordinators, I think Paul mentioned before some of the challenges around the use of the supervisor classification. So what our experience is, there was a mixture within the field between classified as supervisor, classified as after hours coordinator. This cleans that up by putting them all onto one classification based on what their campus is. So that's that, and we'll talk about how they're classified as well. We've also retained the Nurse Manager 5 ADON classification, and that definition is a registered nurse appointed into the role of Assistant Director of Nursing who assists and relieves the DON and or Deputy DON. The employee will translate to the NM5A, 5B, 5C, 5D in accordance with the salary equipment as below. So we'll just go to the next slide, which is, oh, actually, sorry, just go back for a sec, Lexie, to the translation table. Sorry. So here we can see, so for those campus-based, so for those two campus-based classifications, it's still, so they're at that third level there. So you see that they'll translate the same as the DDONs. So the 7B, 8D will go down to the 5D. So your after hours coordinator on one of those sites will be a 5D. And also your ADONs that meet that ADON definition. For campuses that are included at the DON 7A or 8C level, they will translate to a 5C. So your after hours coordinator or your ADON will go to that 5C, unless they're a non-campus specific classification. And your 8Bs and your 8As will just go to the 5B and 5A. If we go back to that 5, just go back to sorry, Lexie, to that one there. Yeah. So that means that for the 5s, we've got the ADON level 1, ADON level 2. They will be classified in accordance with who meets that definition. The nurse manager after hours coordinators will be aligned with the campus of the DON. Same with the ADON there. The 5th classification that we've got in the historically the grade 5 level is the nurse manager or nurse midwife manager not elsewhere classified. So in making the classification structure comprehensive, this is the one that's meant to address those non-traditional units or non-traditional nurse managers that still meet the definition of the stream nurse manager stream definition. So for these people, all the people left in the bucket, because there should only be a small amount of people, will fit under this classification, which will mean that every nurse manager has a classification within the structure. And the final step, or I feel the second last step, is to determine the executive director of nursing classification in accordance with the following. So you'll see there is the definitions at point 2 there. An executive DON is a registered nurse midwife who was appointed in addition to the campus director of nursing to be an executive director of nursing, however titled. And of course, there is some caveats in the agreement because we know that not everyone uses this in their nursing structure. So that first caveat there just says that employees don't have to appoint such a role. And where they do, they can if they choose to. And again, it's dependent upon how the health service approaches nursing structures. They could use that role as one of their campus to meet their campus DON requirement if they wanted to. And the final point there is just in terms of the classification that it is classified as an NM9 and remunerated as such. Just go over the page there. So that's just, we have got in the agreement at Appendix 9 the grouping of the executive DONs, so that people just have to go, like they did Appendix 8 for the DONs, they can just go to Appendix 9 and all the existing EDONs are listed by category within that appendix. So it's a matter of if you've got an EDON at the moment, You just go to that matrix, you see what level they are, and that's their level. That's the translation done and dusted there. For people who aren't on that list or they want to introduce one, then there's still definitions in the agreement so they can do that. They're over the page now. So these are the level descriptors for level A, B, or C. If you're not in a there's just a case of applying those descriptors to get what the classification is. So that takes us over to so should lead us to is following those 6 steps that all the nurse managers within the stream will have a classification. Then it's just a matter of applying the pay rate to determine what the impact is. We know in the short term, all those existing incumbents will not go backwards, so they will all be salary maintained if they did. And really, the only people where the rates are lower than the existing rates are probably at the upper end of the at the 8A level is really the only impact where it goes down, and that's just to accommodate the inclusion of the executive directors of nursing. Everyone else will either stay the same or they'll have an increase from memory. So it's about applying that pay rate to determine what the impact and resolving any relativity. So you may want to go back to those nurse managers not otherwise classified. We know that they will translate to a 5C as a matter of course, but you may just want to look at those wage relativities so that you can preserve your existing structure. So that's the process. What we might do is I might just briefly talk about some of the other changes in the classification structure. Paul touched upon these at the start, but just to give people a broader view of what some of the other changes in the classification structure were. So as part of the bargaining process, we did review all the classifications within the agreement. It has been an exercise that probably hadn't been done for some time, so we thought it was timely that we looked at them. And what we found is that some of those classifications are no longer required to be included in the agreement. So things like the Red Cross Blood Bank, for instance, school nurses, RDNS, those roles just aren't within the sector anymore, so we've removed them. Others we've grandfathered as part of that process. So, for instance, a research nurse 3A is not a classification open to new entrants. It was about grandfathering those people who were at that level originally. So they've been grandfathered, same as the 4A, and also the classification structure has just been amended to clarify that so that people don't inadvertently appoint to those roles. But the structure of the new agreement is such that it won't enable that to occur. There were some classifications within the agreement that didn't have a definition. So they had a classification but no definition. Examples of that were Bush Nursing Centre and also HOS Admin. So HOS Admin we know has been used by some members throughout the service. So we did an exercise just to try and get back to try and work out whether that should be included or not. And after a lot of research, what we identified is that HOS Admin doesn't stand for Hospital Administrator, as I'm sure some people thought it did. It actually stands for Hostel Administrator, which is not being used at all. So we've removed that. So those people that are currently inadvertently being classified as a Hospital Administrator, notwithstanding that doesn't exist, will come across to the nurse manager structure. The supervisor's been removed, as Paul talked about. The ADON's just been slightly amended to make it fit within the new structure. We were hoping the KPI set by the reference group was to try and reduce the number of classifications in the agreement. We were looking pretty good for that for a long period of time, but then, of course, we decided to overtly recognise midwives in the agreement, which has meant that we've needed to introduce separate classifications for those groups. So we've probably failed on that KPI overall. And the other thing that we did is community maternal and health nurse supervisor classification. We've inserted the agreement because it didn't. There wasn't one for that currently. So just over the page. Just in terms of the other classification matters that have changed within the agreement, the statewide classification panel has been amended in terms of what it does and also its configuration. And I think we talked about this last week, but what that looks like now is instead of it being an independent chair plus VHA plus the ANMF, which created a temptation for VHA and ANMF just to disagree with each other every time, it's been moved to a more professional focus. So both the ANMF, VHA will nominate people from the industry to sit on that. So we're hoping that they'll actually be able to provide some better guidance to the independent chair just in terms of those decisions. In terms of its scope, it's gone from emerging classifications to existing classifications, emerging classifications, and there's a couple of other things that it does that we covered off last week. And one of those things that it will do is it will assist with that process of creating an advanced practice liaison nurse coordinators, reviewing the CNC definitions, and also introducing nurse manager descriptors as well. So it's just important that that will, I think, cover 99% of the classifications used by the industry. And so once that work's done, those generic classifications will be removed from the agreement, so they won't be required. I think just a point there is when you're creating your pool of nurse manager classifications, it is going to be important just to have a look at who you've classified on a generic classification, because you'll need to add those people to the pool as well. I think that takes us. So just in terms of a recap. So first step is which stream to create the pool. That stream creates who's in the list that needs to be reclassified. And really, that's just a case of applying the definitions. Step one, you'll find that in that pre-step, applying those stream definitions, one of the issues might just be where there's a management classification within, say, the community health stream. So you'll just need to be mindful of that. That will take precedence. But if there's no such classification, then they'll fit in the nurse manager stream. Identify which campus needs a DON, and for 99.99% of people, that's just looking at Appendix 8. It'll tell you who that is. The second step is to reclassify the DON accordingly. Then we'll move to step 3. So that's just about aligning the DDON, and you do that by reference to the DON classification. Step 4 is making a decision regarding the divisional clinical directors. So this is the program DON. These are additional DONs that you've got within your structure, and really the decision there is to translate them into the DDON level or maintain them, and there'll be a process for accessing additional funding from the department to do that. Step 5 is then we move on to our reclassifying of the grade 5s. So we first look at the non-campus aligned classifications, take them out first, and then that will leave you with the campus aligned people and the not elsewhere otherwise classified. So that should remove those people from the bucket and just leave you with the EDON left. So that obviously then just check to make sure that bucket is empty and resolve any relativities that you may need to once you put the wages next to those people. And of course, just with that is it's important just to obviously write to people, tell them what the impact of that is, and also give them just some guidance around that dispute mechanism, just because we want to make sure that people are heard if they've got any concerns. What we'll do is, I haven't spoken to Paul about this, but I'm sure he'll be on board, is that we'll help create a template and we'll publish that template on the website so that people have a consistent way to do that notification. And that should get us through the NM5 and above translation. Don't know whether there's any comments, Lexie or Paul, you had before we take questions?
No, I have sent to Lexie an example, whether if she's comfortable with sharing that, if she agrees with it firstly, and is comfortable sharing it, because it sounds dreadfully complicated, but when you use an example, it seems to become a bit clearer.
It really is. Once people get into it is really simple. It is really easy. Everything once you've done the DON classification, virtually everything falls into place. The only difficulties are is whether you preserve your clinical, those additional DONs or translate them. That's one decision. And the other decision is about those non-campus specific roles. So you just need to run your eye over them. So that takes us to any questions from the group. I think we've got a couple of questions in the comments.
So I can answer sort of one broad one and say that the fact that the nurse unit manager rates are sometimes higher than the rates for a deputy director of nursing is not new. It has been that way, as has been the case for after-hours coordinators for a very long time. We largely figured that the deputy directors of nursing would typically only exist, or their equivalent in terms of divisional directors, would only really exist in the larger hospitals, typically. But I see in the chat that we have some emerging larger hospitals that used to be small, and that will present issues going into the future. But what I would say is, for the first time, we've got people sort of slotted into places where we can revisit those in 4 years' time and say, well, we now know that it's 11 EFT of nurses in those kind of roles. And without this sort of breakdown, we can't cost what things cost. This will help enormously.
And the department has agreed to fund those translation costs, so it's just a matter of undertaking a process to gather that information. So Kate Bishop has just got, can I please confirm that salary maintenance is for 12 months? So the people are preserved permanently in the roles at the moment, so that no one goes backwards. But again, there's a very small number of people that the rate in the proposed structure is less than their current rate. Very small, like you could probably count it on one hand or two hands. Kathleen's got outpatient ambulatory have traditionally fallen into clinical stream, not community, and applied the whole spectrum of grade 2 classifications, including graduate nurse. Yeah, so the outpatients and ambulatory, I think someone raised that yesterday, so we'll have to have a look at that in terms of that structure. I think people have probably done that differently across the sector to date, but that is one area that we will need to look at. What does hosp admin 4 translate to? So it depends on. I've just got a question there from Doug. So Doug says, "What do hos admin 4 translate to?" Yeah, so that's not a hostel administrator, but it will depend on what definition they meet in the new agreement, Doug. So so there's plenty of definitions. So if you just follow that process, you'll find the definition. Otherwise, they'll fall into that not elsewhere classified bucket. So there will be a classification for them, but it will depend on what they do. How might we address the structural inequity for small rural health services where the NM5 salaries are either less than or barely more than the nurse unit manager salary? Yeah, so that has been an issue. We've tried to address that as best as we can in the new agreement, knowing that there will need to be more work done in that space. But we have tried to address it in terms of making sure that it's above at this stage.
In 2019, all of those lower paid after-hours coordinators actually went up in the 2019 translation because we got rid of the 2 lower increments. So if there is an inequity, it's not as inequitable as it was.
Can you talk further about the preservation process and what grounds can a decision to preserve existing rate classification occur? So I'm just not sure, Melissa, if you're talking about that sort of clinical services level. So what the process for that, what the agreed process with the department is that health services will make the decision about whether to preserve people on those DON levels in addition to the campus DON, and then there'll be a process to record that and reconcile that with the departments. So in terms of the process, it's up to the individual health services to make that decision. And then there's a reconciliation process to ensure that those additional costs are funded for, because for certain health services, and Bendigo will probably be one of them, they do jump up in terms of their DON classification. So obviously if they have more DONs appointed to those campuses, there'll be additional costs. So that's really the key example that we used in our discussions with the department to say this is a gap and it needs to be funded, and there was agreement to do that. I don't know whether that answers your question, Melissa, or you need... And we can talk offline more about that if you need to.
And just to partly address Kathleen's point, the 4 streams don't start until you go past grade 2. There's a second part of the question, whether there is a classification for that work that is higher than grade 2, but the 4 streams don't actually split off until you get past grade 2. So CNS, for example, is the first level of the CAPR stream.
Kathleen, you got a question? You got your hand up?
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. That's helpful. I just a bit nervous about ambulatory and outpatients not having if they're classified in the community stream, there's no classification lower than grade 3 then. So we already have RNs, graduates, all in those. That to me would be a day oncology area or a day medical day ward. We would call those ambulatory wards. So, day patients not admitted for the day, I can't see where I'm going to classify those nurses that are currently in there in that clinical stream. So
You wouldn't.
the work's in the clinical stream, but the work's in the community stream, but the classification is in the clinical stream.
Yeah, I don't think this disrupts that in any way. As I said, the 4 streams don't start until you get past grade 2. There's nothing stopping a grade 2 from working in an ambulatory setting and being paid at grade 2. It's just that they don't fall into any of the new streams. They just stay down at the below level 3 general proposition. So I don't think it disrupts that at all.
Does that address your concern, Kathleen?
Yeah, I think we'll continue the discussion just so we're clear, because I think I can see in the future that's going to be potentially problematic. So let's take it offline and not dominate this discussion with that one question.
No worries, Kathleen. Thanks for your attending and input. Otherwise, just got a question in the chat. Will there be a documented process and templates for referrals to the SCC? Just got a popping up email that's covered that message. Or new industry. Yeah, so like we did with the originating SCCs, that we had templates, etc. So we'll revisit them and just freshen them up. I think the bones are probably there, but they'll probably just need some slight amendments. So we'll work with the ANMF to get those templates available to people.
Tim, there was a question from Central Highlands Rural Health just previously. So Central Highlands is an amalgamation of Hepburn Health Service and Kyneton Hospital. So one's listed as a C and one's listed as a D. Do we have a process for those amalgamations and what they're going to be listed at going forward?
Yeah, so we were very comfortable when we were doing that list that we would know whether there were new campuses coming, and we were very confident that we weren't going to get any surprises. Probably what we neglected to think about is mergers is probably the one that we will need to address. So certainly we'll have a look at that, and there'll need to be a process to address those mergers. I'm sure it won't be really significantly amending what's there, but we'll have a process just so that people to address that, because that's something that we can probably reasonably expect to become more often.
Just to clarify that, Tim, the Appendix 9 determines the EDON level for a multi-campus health service. That there will be different campus DON rates within that health service is fully anticipated. the larger campus might have a higher DON rate than a smaller campus as a sort of translation from bed numbers. So if you're in Appendix 9 as a health service, that determines the EDON rate. And then for each of the campuses, you go to Appendix 8, and yes, you will, parts of your health service may well be in different levels within that grouping.
That's a good point, actually. No, you're right, Paul. It won't disrupt the campus. It'll be at that health service EDON level.
What we have is Central Highlands is not named. That is a natural consequence of us having done this 18 months ago.
Thanks, Paul. So, Kathleen, yes, so the recording will be available to health services. Will the nurse manager matrix assessment process still applies? Yeah, so it will, Louise. So really this is dealing with that NM5 and above levels of the nurse manager structure. So in terms of the NM1, that's our ANM, so they're undisturbed completely. The NM2, 3 and 4 is our nurse unit managers. So that's not disturbed through this process. We know that we will have, as part of that panel that's being formed, descriptors. Part of their work is to develop descriptors for those nurse managers, so 2, 3 and 4. But in terms of this process won't impact those guys. That takes us to all the questions in the chat. I don't know whether anyone else had any questions for us.
I just wanted to clarify too that we are talking about a minimum rate here, and I think Tim's sort of said it a few times that you've got to look at your internal equity issues. I'm fully aware that the clinical directors at Bendigo and Western may well be being paid at the DON rate. They continue to be paid at the DON rate, and you can always pay them more than that if you choose. We won't stand in your way and demand that you comply.
And I think that's the advantage of this structure is that, and the discussions with the department and their support of the parties, in that this structure enables a translation to a different approach, but it also has the flexibility to support existing structures within the health services, which is really important because we don't want anyone to have to reorganise things or do anything new. Existing structures can be accommodated by this structure, by this new classification approach. Any other questions? Look, it really is, once you do it, it will be quite easy. We're available to support people through that process. If people are having difficulties in terms of, please give us that feedback and we'll run more sessions and we'll even turn them into more practical. I think Paul's example of using an example is probably useful. So if people are approaching this and having difficulties, the presentation will be available on our line, but we've also got the slides on Yammer already, so people can access that. But please just give us any feedback or touch base with us, myself, Lexie, the query team, and let us know if you're having any difficulties, because we want to get on top of that as soon as we can to make sure that we've got a pretty smooth translation with this group.
I might also just mention, Tim, that the query team have been doing a lot of work around PD classification. So if you do have any questions about where people fall, they're more than happy to help with those classifications to make sure that you're comfortable with where you're translating people to if there's not a direct translation. And
just to that other point, Kathleen's point, that if you're finding yourself thinking that you have to reclassify a whole load of grade 2s to grade 3 or whatever it might be, it's probably just worth just touching base about that to make sure that that's what's contemplated, because we don't, we'd rather cut that off before it happens than have to undo it if that's the case. But look, thanks everyone for coming. Paul, I don't know whether you had anything you wanted to say before we left.
Happy with that. Thank you.
Lexie?
Only that, I mentioned a couple of people in the chat saying there's an inequity in it. That's an inequity that existed before. We're just giving it a new name. That's not to say we all broadly pat ourselves on the back about that inequity, but this process was about translating people from a bed numbers issue, which was going to be inequitable, to a naming issue that is largely based on historical bed numbers. So just to clarify that.
What we might
also, it might be a first step in a series of steps as well to address those issues, because it will create that transparency now.
What we
So-
might do as well, Tim, is just update the presentation slides and resend them around with what Paul just talked about that translation from bed numbers to the classifications, and we'll pop in what our thoughts were at the time about how the bed numbers now correlate to the classifications in the new structure. And we'll
Sure.
send that.
All right. Thanks, Lexie. Thanks, Paul. Appreciate both your time. Thanks, everyone, for your time as well. Thank you for joining us. We'll talk all soon. See you.
Thank you.